Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Leisure Suit Larry 3, Passionate Patti in Pursuit of the Pulsating Pectorals for PC. This is a parser-based adventure game and the sequel to Leisure Suit Larry Goes Looking for Love in Several Wrong Places, and was developed by Sierra, released in November of 1989, and it's a return to the more raunchy Larry that we saw in the original game, including a kind of amusing quiz that you had to take when you start the game up that tells you how filthy the game is going to be based on your answers. If you answer all of them correctly, then you get the filthiest level, and if you don't answer enough, it'll either kick you out of the game or it will just censor all of the nudity, because there actually is a fairly considerable amount of nudity in this game, even though it's all extremely pixelated and you really can't tell what things are. So I mean, it's not particularly graphic. But even then, that was a fairly big deal in 1989, where there really weren't all that many games that were geared toward the adult audience. So the question really becomes, is this the return to form for Leisure Suit Larry after the kind of disappointing sequel that was Leisure Suit Larry Goes Looking for Love in Several Wrong Places? Or is it something else entirely? Well, as far as presentation goes, it's definitely a step up over the previous two games, at least if you're playing the original versions of the games, in that the sprite work is just more detailed. They put more effort into actually making the characters have more detail on them. The environments have more detail, including things like mirrors, which is actually pretty cool. And it ultimately just ends up looking far better than the previous games did, at least in the case of the original version of Leisure Suit Larry 1. But that's beside the point. And the sound effects are just more of the same, really, the same old beeps and bloops that you're used to from these really old adventure games. So there's not really much to speak of there, and the music is, again, pretty primitive in terms of its actual interpretation, but it's still decently done for Leisure Suit Larry stuff up to this point anyway. So the presentation is an improvement over the previous games, but not by a huge degree. But now what's really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that once again Larry finds himself on the prowl, because this time around, after the events of Leisure Suit Larry Goes Looking for Love in Several Wrong Places, he actually ended up having to get a divorce because his wife divorced him and ran off with a woman. So he's just kind of left with nothing, and he decides that the best way to go about doing this is to don the leisure suit once again and go on the prowl for ladies. And that goes about as well as you can expect after having played previous Leisure Suit Larry games. So most of the game is spent pursuing various women that you run across throughout the game, and it ends in various amusing ways because things rarely, if ever, go well for Leisure Suit Larry. And the plot itself actually just goes kind of bonkers at one point, but that's toward the end of the game, and that's after you have gone through the kind of twist in this, in that you don't just play as Larry in this game, you actually play as both Larry and Patti. And you would know Patti, of course, from the title of the game, but she is one of Larry's pursuits, and at one point you take control of her after there's a misunderstanding with Larry and you go off to find him. And it's kind of a refreshing change, even though the gameplay itself doesn't change any. But needless to say, the plot really isn't a strong suit of this game. It's not a very compelling plot. It's just kind of a vehicle for the various jokes that are going to be thrown around in here. And some of the jokes are actually pretty funny, others not so much. It's a kind of a hit or miss thing. Although you can get some extra amusement out of switching the default expletive. Yes, it'll actually show different expletives depending on what your filthiness level is, but you can still change that anyway, and you can change it to something completely and utterly ridiculous, and that's good for a few laughs here and there. And in general, the game is pretty funny, so it does its jokes rather well for the most part, at least compared to the previous game. So at least that's an improvement, but what about the gameplay? Well, it's what you've come to expect from a parser-based adventure game, in that you walk around with the keyboard, and then if you come across an object that you want to interact with, you type in your command to interact with it. And it's a pretty straightforward, simple way of doing things, but at the same time, once again, it's a bit hard to get your bearings at times, and so you might spend some time just wandering around aimlessly, not really knowing what you're supposed to do. And there is a fair amount of trial and error in this thing, so you do need to keep that in mind. The mantra of save often comes to mind. But again, if you've played any other parser-based adventure games, you would know that already. And of course, if you played other Sierra games, then you would know that some of the puzzle solutions, not all of them, but some of them are a bit obtuse. Luckily, that wasn't really a huge problem until King's Quest V, so in this particular game, you're not really running into a lot of those kind of puzzles, just a few of them here and there, and even then, they're not really all that obtuse. They're just obtuse enough that you have to think about it for a while and really think outside the box. It's something bizarre. But it's what you've come to expect from Leisure Suit Larry. The solutions are usually just silly, and the game itself is just silly. It's definitely a game that you can get something out of if you've played the previous two, or just one of the previous Leisure Suit Larry games, and enjoyed it anyway. And even though some of the humor is dated, it's still a pretty amusing game overall, though you might have some trouble answering the questions if you don't know anything that a supposed adult at the time would know. Of course, I'm referring to the quiz that you have to take at the beginning of the game, but even then, the audience for this game is kind of limited. If you liked the previous Leisure Suit Larry games, you will probably like this one too. In fact, it's definitely better than the previous one, that's for sure. But if you're going into this series, this is a decent enough starting point if you've never played any of the others, but I really do recommend going with Leisure Suit Larry 1 first, particularly the VGA remake, because that's just so much easier to play than these parser-based adventure games were. So right off the bat, you're getting a limited audience based on it being a parser-based adventure game alone, but also because it's a Leisure Suit Larry game, and that's just not going to appeal to everybody. Is it a bad game? No, definitely not. It's actually a pretty solid game overall, but it's definitely dated, and it's definitely more of a for fans thing than anything else. So again, if you liked the previous Leisure Suit Larry games, I recommend checking out Leisure Suit Larry 3. It's kind of a return to form for the series, even though it's not quite as funny as the original game was. But if you're someone who hasn't played any of the previous games, I recommend starting with the first game before you go into this one. Thanks for watching.